And welcome back. Now we are going to go ahead and look at a concept called snapping. So previously if I wanted to put multiple objects together, so let me just go ahead and quickly duplicate this here with a couple more objects. If I wanted to put these together, all right, I can try to get these so that way they are close, but there's always this chance that no matter what I do, there's going to be maybe just a little bit of gap or something in between them. And we can rotate through this and see I did an okay job here, but it may not be perfect. So I'm just going to Control Z real quick here and back it up to our original shape. Instead, we're going to use something called snapping. And up here at the top, you'll see this little magnet-like symbol. If I click on that, that's going to allow me to enable snapping, which was going to pretty much make this object move around a lot more freely. So if I just press G to get this kind of free transform, you'll notice that instead of this object easily moving around, it kind of is restricted to these isometric boxes that are along our grid here. And that is part of that snapping property. It's keeping this cube much more restrained to within certain parameters here. Now real quick, I'm going to just switch this to the X view here, just to let you see this. And I'm going to go ahead and try to zoom in a little bit here. And you can see now we have smaller squares available to us. So now if I try to move this, and I try to move this nice and slowly, you'll see that it more snaps to those smaller squares. Where if I go ahead and zoom this back out, so let's just go ahead and just place this, and zoom it back out, and where we only see these, and now when I move it, you'll see it jumps more of these whole units here, rather than those smaller individual ones. So it's also another way to have some of that grander control, because this is kind of moving about 1 meter each, because that's about how wide these squares are apart. Whereas if I zoom it back in, you can, again, we have these which are about 0.1. And so then when we move here, it's going to attempt to jump in between each of those different areas there. So a nice way to kind of keep your shapes and confined to more of a definite zone. Now, one thing to know, if I'm here in snapping view and I want to kind of temporarily be out of the snapping view here, so let's just go to G. And if I press and hold down Control, you'll see we get some of that familiar free transformation available back to us. So we do get some of that here available. All we got to do is press Control though. Right. And there we go. Kind of nice back in nice order. Now these, of course, when we're moving this is, of course, moving as you saw, like by about 0.1, about 1. So it is, again, an approximation of how this works. Now, one thing you will notice that if I go ahead and release this in an area that is not a whole value here, so for example, I hold down Control and I release this into a fractional area here, the next thing that'll happen, if I go ahead and release this, it will still snap by the same unit of increments, but you'll notice that it is now snapping along in that same fractional values. And we can confirm this by opening up our transformation window here. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this guy down real quick. If we go ahead and open up this transform window here, and we watch this snap, we can see how it moves in the same amount. So you look and we can see that Y value is changed by 0.1 every time, even though it was originally is no longer in the starting values of 0, 1, etc. And if I were to go ahead and zoom this back out and go ahead and reapply this, you'll then see we are still kind of having the same kind of familiar values here as we move through this. All right. Now, one thing that we didn't really take a look at is this little feature right here called absolute grid snap. If I go ahead and check this box right here, and then I go ahead to move it, one thing you'll find is that it's always going to kind of come right back to those nice absolute squares there. So this is a kind of a nice little thing to kind of, if you want to follow everything along to these same areas here. Or if you're like, oh, I need to get it realigned and you don't want to have to go through and retype all these numbers, the absolute grid snap is a great way to kind of help get you in here and get your cubes or spheres or whatever you want back in within that zone. Now we do have other modes that you might saw in here. such as vertex, edge, face, project, range nearest, volume, edge center, edge perpendicular. So we do have other modes in here that we can use. And let's just take a moment to look at least at one of them. So let's start with vertex. And we do have other modes in here that are applicable. And we're not going to really mess around with those for much now. So let's just go ahead and just like rotate this here just a little bit so we can see our other cube. And I just want to go ahead and duplicate this real quick. Now, if you recall previously when we tried to work with these, one of the things that we saw when we tried taking these two shapes here, and I went ahead and tried to put them on top of each other, they would of course just move through each other. But if we go ahead and put this on with the vertex mode, we should now have some snapping available that we can go ahead and snap these shapes together, where they should go ahead and have, you can see how they're trying to get each other to kind of merge in here. So we can see right here we have a snap together with this one. So I'm just going to go ahead and rotate this around. And it's because it's just trying to put those two sides there together. So again, if I try to put this here, the other option it might give us is it might try to stack these up to each other. But right here's one vertex that wants to kind of go together. And that will of course do that. If I duplicate this again, we have that same snapping. We can of course also get it to snap so that we can make kind of a nice filled in shape here. So we may have to play around with this a little bit because we do have other options here with our vertex snapping. But this is just one of those many options that you can play around with to kind of get these shapes the way you want them to be. Now if we look at, for example, at edge here with closest, just want you to see how this is going to be a little different. So here's an edge one, and so if I try to line that up, you can see it's trying to line up along the edges here. So again, it's another way to kind of get these shapes so that they kind of come here together. But you can see edge is a little different than vertex because we can see it's going more off the edge just to see how these different pieces kind of work together. I'm just going to go ahead and actually just take these cubes and just go ahead and delete them out. Let's just add a fresh cube in here just so we can see this. And we'll just go ahead and duplicate. And you can see with our freshly put cube in here, again, we want to make sure that we have our snap set on. We have vertex. And again, you have all these different options here. So effect, move, rotate, scale. You can again come in here and play around with these different pieces just to see how that they work. And again, I just want to show you how this works in a little bit more detail. So if we go ahead and just take this new cube here, and the trick here is you want to, when you're moving these to snapping, is not to actually grab it from the middle because that's a little deceptive because you want to align it up with your corners here because this is a vertex. So the vertex, of course, being these points, these corners here of this cube. So for example, if I'm here with this corner, you can then have a little bit more control over where you want to be. So when you start snapping, a little advice here is to try and make it so that you're looking exactly where you want that vertex to point. And you can see that gives me a lot more control over where I might want my next shape to go. So if I go ahead and duplicate this next one again, and let's just go ahead and let's maybe put them here for temporarily. And then we can go G, and you can see I'm going to grab right here from this corner. And maybe I can then bring it up, and you can see we got something to snap. And just like that, we are now creating something much more complex, and these are coming together real nicely because again, we're using snapping to kind of help bring our shape together. The last thing I want to show with this is, of course, we can also still scale these and they will still retain some of these snapping properties. So for example, I'm just going to shrink this down just a little bit here. And if I go ahead and using this, let's grab our corner, we can still snap to. And you can see that it still retains the ability of snapping even if I go ahead and scale it or resize or transform it in any way. Because again, this one is using the vertices. There are, again, other modes that you can come in here and play around with. But I want you to challenge yourself. See what you can create using snapping that might make your life a little easier versus before we have had to go through and manually adjust everything.